All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our ninth episode of Blast from the Past, the show where Armin and I sit down with former members of Congress. Today, we're happy to have our guest, Wayne Gilchrest, who represented Maryland's 1st Congressional District, the Eastern Shore, as a Republican from 1991 until 2009. And we're going to be asking him a few questions today and spending just a couple of minutes on each one, and the whole thing should be done in a nice, easy format. So, welcome, Congressman Gilchrist. Happy to have you here.
Thank you very much.
All right. So, Armand, go ahead with the first question.
Yes, thank you, Congressman Gilchrest, for coming to speak with us. I want to ask you, so you were one of six brothers in your household growing up, if I read correctly. You were later decorated for your service in the Dominican Republic and Vietnam with the U.S. Marine Corps before returning home and going into education. I was wondering, could you briefly tell the viewers more about your early years and how they affected your eventual career?
Wow. Um, sure. Do you have about 3 hours now? I can reminisce about the old days. Well, I'm one of six boys, except for my youngest brother, we're all a year or less apart. So we grew up together as a group in a neighborhood. Um, it was pretty diverse. Everybody had working parents, so the kids were on their own for a good amount of time. So we learned. I guess it was also awful natural at the time, but we learned how to maneuver through the world by figuring things out with a diverse group of kids. And then most everybody, in other words, if your neighbor saw you doing something wrong, they could reprimand you just like your parents did. Or if we wanted to play baseball or horseshoes or basketball or football, we just roamed the neighborhood till we found enough people to have a pickup game either in the park or right in the street. All our neighbors were, World War II vets or Korean War vets. They ranged from Eastern Europe to other places. We were only a few blocks to where I guess you could say the black neighborhood was, but we played with everybody. And some parents were racist and some parents weren't. We, at an early phase in our growing up years, pretty much realized that the people who were not racist were smarter than the people who were. And it was a great upbringing. Almost everybody that got out of high school went in the service of one form or another. Then when we got out of the service, we some went to college and some went on to work in industry, some factory close by. Then gradually, some of us started moving away. So I have to say, Eisenhower was my president when I was growing up. I do remember a little bit about Truman and my mother telling us about the Korean War when we were kids. Um, and I remember my mother telling us secretly, very, very secretly, that she voted for Kennedy and not Nixon. My father was a very right wing Republican. Um, and of course, we went through the 60s, which were pretty tumultuous looking back. When you live through something like that, it just takes a long time to happen. So it's not as tumultuous when you're living through it. That was pretty devastating when John F. Kennedy was shot and killed. And then certainly Martin Luther King Jr. was shot and killed. Then Bobby Kennedy was shot and killed. So we had a lot of, then, the uprisings and the riots for justice and all kinds of things. So I think that was, and America lived through it. Uh, and I think we can live through the present crisis of misinformation and arrogance and ignorance and a divided nation. So anyway, I ran for Congress actually just because I always wanted to run for Congress. When I reached 40, I quit my teaching job and went and lived in northern Idaho in the wilderness. Broke my jaw, I had to come back. So what was I going to do? So I ran for Congress, and eventually I won. So and I got there. So I'm going to stop talking now.
Oh,
No,
that's
that's
good.
quite a story. Thank you.
Yeah. So, speaking about running for Congress, you faced three tough campaigns earlier in your career. You narrowly lost a race against then embattled incumbent Roy Dyson, but beat him 2 years later. And you had a redistricting race against another incumbent, Tom McMillan, where you mobilized the Eastern Shore to win. And you talked about your teaching job briefly, but and now we know as well answers the first part of the question: what encouraged you to run for Congress? But do you think your outsider background helped you connect to voters in your community during your campaigns?
Definitely. There was no question about it. I hit the trail at the right time, in the right place, with the right background. I was often advertised as a house painter, which I actually was for a while, and as a school teacher. And I didn't know anything about campaigning or raising money or anything like that. But the incumbent was getting so much bad press about a lot of different things. And the key issue that made me run for Congress, though, was that Roy Dyson wanted to send troops to Nicaragua. And I was so against that, having been in Vietnam and knowing how the terrible butchery that people go through, and then the civilians that suffer so much. And we saw civilians suffer from bombing and slaughter. And I was so angry that I didn't think I was going to win. I didn't think I was ever going to get close, but I wanted to speak out against that really terrible idea of sending troops down to Nicaragua. So anyway, yeah, I uh, campaigning is like volunteering to have irritable bowel syndrome. That's what campaigning is like.
Could you briefly talk a little bit about, I mean, the Eastern Shore as a geographic area is almost as big as pretty much the same size from top to bottom as my home state of New Jersey. So could
Oh
you
yeah.
talk, how was campaigning in the district?
Um, you know, I've always been, when you have a job to do, you just do the job. I can tell you, looking back now, it's not like Alaska or Montana,
No.
but
Yeah.
you've got a long drive. If you're going to cover your district, you have to do it in sections. You go to the southern part of the Eastern Shore, you're going to spend 2 or 3 days there. Then you'll spend 2 or 3 days in another few counties, and 2 or 3 days in another few counties. But you don't cover the district in one day, because you have all of the Eastern Shore of Maryland, and then you have several counties on the Western Shore, which are pretty spread out.
Mhm.
So campaigning, you had to have a pretty good commitment if you want to campaign on the Eastern Shore. So, especially if you didn't have much money.
Yeah.
So we always, every single time, we never went past a radio station. We never went past a newspaper. We stopped every single time unannounced at these places, always. And many times we got some press out of it, because then they didn't have to go track you down. Of course, there was no internet either at the time.
Hmm.
Right.
Armin, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. So when you did get to Congress, you were never afraid to speak your mind on issues that you were passionate about, even if it meant disagreeing with the large majority of your caucus. In 1993, you notably were the only Republican to vote for making Washington, D.C. a state.
Yeah.
And in 2007, you were the member most likely to break with your caucus. I believe some organization determined that statistic. So, what inspired you to go your own way and, kind of be your own person? And who were some of your biggest political mentors in the Republican caucus back when you first came to Congress?
Um, Fred Upton from Michigan um, was very helpful, and actually the minority leader, Bob. Oh my God, now I can't think of his name.
Michael?
Michael.
Bob Michael, was such uh, a professional, fresh air. He said, you come here, you serve your country, you develop policy, you get on a committee, you become expert on that particular issue. Members will trust you because of your information. And I said, that's great. That's how things are supposed to work. But gradually, that's not how things work. Uh, it was whoever gave you the most money. Um, and the whole idea of starting up a base. And that's where lobbyists began to I mean, they always had influence. They always had influence. But yeah, I think Fred Upton started what was called the Tuesday Group, was a group of about 40 Republicans throughout the 90s that were more moderate and could come together to form a block of votes, which could have a positive effect on how legislation went through. Um, so anyway, but I always felt you're pressured to the degree that you allow yourself to be pressured. And I was there not to please some other person or party. I was there to try to develop best policy I could, and it was an enormous um, positive place to be as a member of Congress, because no matter who you called, some university, whether it was Harvard or Stanford or Yale or Cornell or NYU, you name it, if you wanted some expertise, they returned your phone call. Not to mention the fact that you have the entire Library of Congress at your fingertips. It's the library for members of Congress. So they have every expert on every issue. If you want to come up with information, you call the Library of Congress. And most of the time, they send somebody to your office to give you a lecture. Ron Paul, for example, once a week, you remember Ron Paul.
Mhm.
He was really good with foreign policy. Ron Paul, myself, Walter Jones from North Carolina, and a few other members would meet every Wednesday in Ron Paul's office over lunch, and we would discuss a particular issue, mostly about the Middle East. And someone from the Library of Congress would come over that was an expert in that particular field. So it was amazing, just amazing. So, yeah, I forget what the original question was now. I rambled on.
Yeah, I mean, I think you talked about it a little bit. I mean, it was just what inspired you to go in your own
Oh,
direction.
oh, right. I think it was just a whole lot of people, just a whole lot of people that the whole place opened up to me. Some guy from, you know, Hickville is now in Congress. Never expected that to happen. And you have all this stuff available to you. So there was a lot of people were my mentors, not to mention the fact that my children were watching. And integrity was a big part about raising my children. So they would often question what's going on, and you know, I wanted them, I wanted them to be proud of their father, and they wouldn't be if I was a puppet, a marionette that somebody else controlled me. So that was a part of it as well.
Hmm. Well, good. That's very interesting. I especially liked the discussion about the Library of Congress because I feel like a lot of people don't know that. Um, but next question deals with your last election in 2008. So you faced a primary challenge from the right from Andy Harris, who currently holds the seat, and he pretty much won the primary election. We have a map that my friend Armin, who's with us right now, made. If I could share that by doing well in the Baltimore suburbs, while you did very well on the Eastern Shore. Um, so, just a general, my question for you, it was two part, but it's just one part now. We recently interviewed another Republican member from South Carolina, Bob Inglis, and
Yes,
he lost his primary to Trey Gowdy by 40 points in 2010
right.
after coming out in favor of a carbon tax
Yes,
as a means of addressing climate change. So, with
yeah.
that said, do you believe that the NRCC should have done more to protect a longtime incumbent like you against a primary challenge, people like Inglis, just in general?
I guess so, but you know, I don't know. Let me say something about Bob English. Bob and I would have conversations about climate change when we were both members together. And you know what pushed him to taking on climate change was his son. His son was, I think, like a biology major or a college graduate with a biology major who kept talking to Bob about climate change. And then Bob would come to me because he knew I was a climate change junkie. So we had many conversations, and he knew that if he embraced climate change, which was in fact the basic science, he was going to lose his election. But he did it anyway. One, for his son, and two, it was the right thing to do. And now he's spending his life pursuing that goal to educate Americans about climate change. Yeah. So, and I knew members would come up to me all the time and say, "Look, you got to vote this way. You got to vote this way, because you lose your election." And they said, "You can't do anything if you're on the outside, so you got to stay here." And I said, "Well, that's true, but if I stay here and I have to keep compromising my votes, what's the sense of staying here?" So the biggest issue was there was and it's still very strong, probably stronger now, the Club for Growth and a number of other sort of quiet, shadowy entities. They look for people that they can totally control. And that's who they focus their attention on and give money to. And their goal is not to defeat Democrats. Their goal is to get Republicans that they can control in Congress. And Andy Harris is one of those. I was several times prior to Andy Harris, the Club for Growth supported people running against me, but it was my issue coming out. I think, besides the fact I had widespread support, but it was only an inch deep because I was pro-life. I was pro-choice, pro-gay rights. I wanted some reasonable gun control, but then I came out against the war. So I think that was the final straw that broke the. And then I was redistricted too, more conservatives.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, yeah, that's. I don't. They could. I don't know if they could have helped. I really don't. You got a pretty steep division there in the voters.
Yeah.
I see. Well, so following up on that, you recently have left the Republican Party and become a Democrat. You notably endorsed the Democratic nominee in 2008, Frank Cradaville,
Yes.
and you have endorsed other Democrats against Andy Harris since Andy Harris has made a name for himself in far-right Republican circles for various things that he says or does. So I guess could you just describe what your thought process has been in leaving the GOP?
Well, I just got tired of talking facts with the GOP. Whether it was the war, the geopolitical fracturing of the balance of power in the Middle East. You couldn't get people to understand the history and the realities of that place. And then I was tired of trying to convince my Republican colleagues that we're in a very dangerous planetary situation with climate change. Why do I spend all my time trying to convince them that it's real when I can't convince them? That and a number of other issues, I said, well, I'm wasting my time. I didn't want to waste my time anymore. So I got with a group of people that are rationally, reasonably, logically looking at basic facts, the science. And I didn't want to be around anybody that was either too ignorant to know what was going on, or they were too racist to want to know what's going on, or too arrogant, or too dogmatic, or they didn't mind being a puppet. So I joined a party that is way more diverse in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. And our last question, as Democrats dominate Maryland, Baltimore and the DC suburbs get most of the attention. How do you think Democrats should address issues in the mostly Republican Eastern Shore communities?
Well, the woman now running against Andy Harris is Heather Mazur. And Heather is the type of person that if people can listen to her talk, she's quite progressive too. But she's very smart. And I'm still, basically, I say, you got to say what you believe. One of Andy Cradaville's fears was voting for the Affordable Care Act. And I said, get out there and tell people that it's good. Just tell everybody what the facts are instead of hesitating. So what Heather's going to do is tell people how the Eastern Shore can be better for everybody, better environmentally, better healthcare wise, better economically, if people work together and find out what the real facts are. So The Democrats shouldn't hesitate or be tentative. There's a lot of good stuff that Biden is trying to do that's going to benefit you. Okay.
All right.
You guys are good. I like you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Where are you located in New Jersey?
I'm at the College of New Jersey right now, which is near Trenton, but I normally live further north in Somerset County.
Okay. Armand, are you there too?
No, I'm from Massachusetts.
Massachusetts. My brother lives in Cape Cod.
Oh, very nice.
Okay.
Very nice.
So if I go visit my brother, I'll come visit you. And if I have a brother in New Jersey, I'll come visit you, Harrison.
Oh, good.
Great.
Okay. I got to see those kids. They're waiting for me.
All right.
right.
Thank you very
Thanks
much for your
so
time,
much.
Congressman
Have a good
Gilchrest.
one.
Bye.
Bye.
I know how to turn this off now. I'm not sure if I know how to turn it off. I'm going to try.